Hi, I'm Anne. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be continuing on my video from Saturday where I'm counting down my top 100 classics. I decided to put out the video today as opposed to Saturday because Saturday I want to do a mid-month wrap-up of all the books that I've read so far this month. So, as I said in my previous video, don't come at me if like your favorite classic isn't on here. I am pulling from the pool of classics that I've actually read, and I know there are quite a few classics that I haven't read and I want to read, even if it's by the same author that maybe I featured one of their books on this list, but I might actually prefer another one of their books, but I haven't read it yet. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. This is just my opinion of my favorite classics. Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. This may be a contentious opinion, but here's the thing. I don't necessarily think it's her best work. I would probably argue that Sense and Sensibility is her best work. Personally, that's just me. However, I do think that Pride and Prejudice has made such a big impact culturally on our society that you have to put this on the list. It is so massive, whether because of all the movies that have been made, whether it's because of more of the modern adaptations. For example, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. It's a great example. Bridget Jones' Diary. It has impacted society in the 200 some years since it has come out, so much more than all of Jane Austen's other works. Next one is The Art of War by Sun Tzu. This is a how to go to war. 5 dangerous faults may affect the general. One is recklessness, which will lead to destruction. So that's just an example of like, it's basically how to wage war. It is fascinating. Next one, I actually just finished this week, and it's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. By Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So Solzhenitsyn was a Russian who was imprisoned in the Gulag Soviet war camps for, I believe, 8 or 11 years he was imprisoned. And he wrote The Gulag Archipelago as a nonfiction documenting his life in the gulags. It's an exceptional book, but it's also about 1,500 pages total between all the volumes. However, this one is a short fictional retelling of a day in the life of this man in a gulag camp. So it's a great recommendation, and that's why I'm going to keep recommending it, simply because it's easier. It's much easier to recommend someone a 150-page classic as opposed to a 1,500-page classic. I mean, you can't get people to read War and Peace. You think they're going to read the Gulag Archipelago? I don't think so. Next one is Musui's Story, the autobiography of a Tokugawa samurai by Katsu Kokichi. So this man wrote a diary when he was quite old in the 1800s, and it documents the life of his life. It's basically how not to be a samurai, because he does almost everything wrong, but it is fascinating because it shows what life was like for samurai back in Japan in the 1800s, near the end of the Tokugawa era. And yeah, it's a hilarious read, but it's also quite fascinating to learn about the era. Next one is History by Herodotus. Herodotus was a 3rd century BC, about 4th century. He was writing about a couple generations after the Persian and the Greek city-states war. So think 300 with King Leonidas, the movie, and the Spartans against the Persians, these 300 men against, multiple thousand Persians. That's where this comes from. And he was the first, he's called the father of history simply because he was the first to actually try to document histories, even though some of this is more fantasy and fiction than actual history, but it's a fascinating read about the ancient Greek wars. All right, the next one is Hiroshima Diary by Michihiko Hachira. This is a diary of a doctor who survived Hiroshima, the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima in 1945, and he barely survived, might I add. His wife ended up succumbing to her wounds later, but he documented both his life in the first few days following the Hiroshima atomic bomb dropping, as well as once he was up and about, him taking care of patients, and then the long-term effects of the nuclear bomb on these people, being exposed to radiation. So it's a fascinating, wonderful read. I highly recommend it. Next one is Asterix the Gaul by Renee Goscinny. So I talked about Tintin in my last video, where I absolutely love Tintin, but this one is similar to Tintin. It was written about the same era. I think this came out in like the 40s and 50s, and it follows this group of Gauls surviving during a time of Roman occupation in what would become England, I think. It's a great, hilarious comic series. I highly recommend it. The next one is Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw. This is a play that was later adapted into the movie My Fair Lady, which I have many negative thoughts about My Fair Lady just because it actually absolutely butchered the play. Basically, it tells of this man who decides to make over this basic flower girl into a lady in London. And of course, hilarity ensues, but it is also a fascinating commentary on these characters. All right, the next one is The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich A. Hayek. He talks about, from a psychological standpoint, how Russia came from enslaved itself to these ideals, to these dictators, to Stalin. In a sense, how society led about that. So he traces back in history to why the Soviets were able to take over, why people like the Nazis were able to take over, and tries to understand that in order to prevent it in the future. It's a fascinating psychological read. Next one is Gaudy Night by Dorothy L. Sayers. I had to put one of hers in here, and I personally think this one is her best mystery novel. Next one is De-anime by Aristotle. This one means on the soul. That's what de-anime means, and it is basically a philosophical argument as to why each human has a soul. And this is coming from Aristotle, who of course was pagan. He wasn't Christian. He wasn't like religious in the sense that we in the modern age would think of people who argue that you have a soul. The next one is Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. This was a childhood favorite of mine when I was younger. I was forced to read this in school, and I remember the first time I read it, I hated it because I was sobbing at the end. It talks about Charlotte, who is a spider, and she befriends Wilbur, this tiny little pig that is put on this farm, and it's about their adventures and their story, and it has a very sad ending. I won't get into the details, but looking back at it, it's one of the most powerful books that I read as a child, and the one that stood out to me as being so impactful that I still remember it, and that's why I recommend it. Even if you're an adult, it's a brilliant book. Next one is Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol. So Gogol was, I want to say Russian, but I'm pretty sure he was born in a country that borders Russia, so technically he wasn't Russian, but he wrote in Russian. But he was a contemporary to, well, maybe slightly after, but he was around the contemporary to Fyodor Dostoevsky as well as Leo Tolstoy. And he wrote several books. I've only read this one. Dead Souls tells the story of this man in the early 1800s who seeks to buy dead serfs from people, and so it's a mystery as you're trying to solve what exactly is going on. It's also a bit of a comedy. You get to know all these ridiculous wealthy people in Russia, and it's making fun of the Russian hierarchy that existed in the early 1800s. It's a fascinating read. The next one is The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. This was another one that I loved when I was a child. It tells of all these animals that can speak, and they wear suits like Toad, and they're just amazing characters that have problems, and they go about their life, and they go traveling together. It's such a cute story. Next one is, okay, I know I wasn't going to have multiple authors, but I did break that last time, so I'm going to break it once this time, and that is for Ray Bradbury, because I did say Fahrenheit 451 was his best one, and I think I agree with it just with how impactful it has been on society. However, personally, I think my favorite is Something Wicked But This Way Comes, and this is a Halloween story about this mysterious circus that comes to town, and these two boys have to figure out what's going on about it. It's a brilliant book, and I think it's my favorite Ray Bradbury, even if I think Fahrenheit 451 is the best. So I'm breaking my rule just for this one. I broke it for Ernest Hemingway. I can break it for Ray Bradbury. Anyway, the next one is La Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Mallory. My mom has a massive copy of this. One year, I don't know what was wrong with me, I decided to just go through it and read the entire thing. And it's about Arthur, King Arthur and his knights and all the stories that revolved around it. I believe it was written in the, I'm thinking 1400s, but it might have been a little bit around that era. Next one is The Dialogue of Comfort Against Tribulation. Thomas More wrote Utopia, which is his most famous work, which I haven't read yet. I will someday. But Sir Thomas More was an advisor to Henry VIII who disagreed with his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and in doing so, Henry VIII decided to try him for treason and then execute him. So when Sir Thomas More was being held in the Tower of London in prison, he wrote this book, The Dialogue of Comfort Against Tribulation. And while it is a theological religious text, it is more so an idea of like accepting that you will die, but then being comforted in grief and facing death. It's a fascinating read. Next one is another Catholic writer, and that is Confessions by Saint Augustine of Hippo, or Augustine of Hippo. He was from Hippo. He was a Catholic theologian, considered one of the greatest theologians. He wrote City of God as well. But his Confessions is more of his autobiography that he wrote about himself. And he was a wild card when he was young. He had an affair. He had an illegitimate son. He had a lot of stuff going on in his life, but it's really fascinating because it traces his search for truth, and he eventually becomes more religious. But in the beginning of his life, he is interested in all these different, as the Catholic Church called during that time, heresies, different ideas, different philosophies that may have been tied to Christianity but weren't quite the same. So for me, that was the most fascinating part of reading this book, is just understanding all the different like belief systems that were out there in the 400s. And it makes me realize that, yeah, things weren't much different back then in the 400s as they are now, where you have like very different faiths that are disagreeing about everything. It hasn't changed much. It's always been like that. Next one is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. It's about Heathcliff and his romance and then his descent into madness. Emily Bronte is a brilliant author, and I always avoided reading this book because I was like, well, it's a gothic romance about these two horrible human beings. Why would I ever want to read it? And then I read it, and then I realized it's much more of a cautionary tale with this deeply steeped gothic description that's just so pretty. So it's a great book. The next one is The Little Prince by, forgive me, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. So Antoine, I'll just say that, he was a French author who is in war, and he ended up dying in World War II a year or two after finishing this book. And it tells of this alien prince who crashes into a desert and has to find his way around. The Prince is just such a beautiful book, and it has such beautiful art in it as well. The next one is Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux, another French author. This one I feel like, again, needs no introduction. The Phantom of the Opera tells of the Phantom of the Paris Opera in Paris, and Christine, this beautiful soprano. Now, if you've seen the movie or the musical, which is kind of what popularized the Phantom of the Opera, it's totally different than the book. The book actually follows this detective who is trying to solve the mystery of the Phantom of the Opera. I no offense to the musical, I love the music in the musical. I love a lot of things about the musical, but the book is just so much better because it is framed as this like murder mystery that you are trying to solve, the unwind these pieces of this twisted world of the Phantom of the Opera, even though you still have Christine and Raoul and all these people. The next one is one that I never hear nowadays, but was such a big part of my growing up years, and that is The Swiss Family Robinson by Johann David Weiss. So it tells the story of this family who gets marooned on this island and end up living there for a few years. There's this movie that was made of it in the 50s. I think the movie and book are quite different, but I remember having this very old copy from like the 50s or 60s book of the book that I would read from all the time because it's an adventure. The next one technically isn't a book, it's a short story, but I have seen it printed in book form, just in like a very small book. That is The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood. Algernon Blackwood can create a creepy atmosphere, like a psychologically disturbing atmosphere, like no other author I've ever read. He's very similar to H.P. Lovecraft in that sense. But basically, this one is about these people who get lost in a forest and there are rumors of monsters. It's a truly creepy horror from the early 20th century. The next one is another horror, and that's Dracula by Bram Stoker. In fact, I have a copy of this book. I don't know where it is. I don't know where it went. I haven't seen it since I moved into my new apartment, so I'm sure I'll find it eventually. But basically, it started the trend of vampire obsession. But basically, it follows this ancient Transylvanian count who is a vampire, and yes, all the people that destroy him and try to end his reign of destruction. Yeah. The next one is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This was another favorite when I was a child, especially since I really related to Mary Lennox. Basically, it's about this orphan who lived with her family in India, but then all her family died, and she returns to England to live with her uncle in this mysterious house. And at this house, there is this secret garden that has been closed and locked up for years since her uncle's wife died. And so she's kind of piecing together what happened, as well as opening the hearts of the people in the house. It's a really cute novel, and like I said, I always related to Mary Lennox because she starts out as a bit of a brat, and I was totally a brat when I was younger, so I related to her. It's a great heartwarming book. Next one is, I guess this would be two books, but I'm just going to do the first one. That is the Iliad by Homer. I personally prefer this more than the Odyssey because the Odyssey is basically just a high seas adventure as Odysseus is trying to get back home, whereas the Iliad is this epic battle that you have gods and you have two sides of the fight, and there's just so many characters, so many players to keep track of. It's such a complex story. It's about the possibly mythic. It probably has some basis in history, but we don't know quite how historical it is. Fight between Greece and Troy. The next one is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor L. Frankl. So Viktor E. Frankl was a psychologist who was in the Nazi concentration camps for several years. He ended up surviving, but he wrote this book as a window into how these prison camps were run, how twisted some of the guards were, how twisted some of the prisoners became, just how life was, what you needed to do to survive. It is an exceptional book, but quite dark as well. The next one is an epic poem, and that is Beowulf. No author. We don't know the author. It was written, I believe, around 800, and it tells of this guy, this warrior, who takes on monsters. But it's a beautiful epic poem to read, especially if you get a good translation. I don't remember the translation I read. I'd have to look it up because currently my mother is actually borrowing the book that I have Beowulf in, but I remember reading it during my first degree of college, and it's just a fascinating poem to read. All right, the next one is Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. I have a copy that is the movie edition, and I wish I didn't get this copy because the movie from 2005 was interesting. It wasn't great. But this tells of a chocolate factory, and this very rich man who says, okay, I'm going to put 7 tickets, I think it's 7 tickets, in 7 golden tickets in Wonka bars around the world, and all the people who win it, those kids are going to be invited to tour my factory. That's the premise. It's fascinating. It's great. It gets dark. All right, the next one is the Book of Chunsu by Chunsu. So this is an epic adventure novel. That's the best way to describe it. I believe it was written during the Qing Dynasty, but it might have been the Ming Dynasty. I'm not quite sure. But yeah, it's also, I think another title for it is The Outlaws of the Marsh, and it's a Chinese adventure novel. The best way to describe it. It's a fascinating read. All right, the next one is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. This follows this really weird girl who falls down a rabbit hole, ends up in this kooky, hallucinogenic world, and she has tea with strange people and meets a queen that wants to cut off her head. The next one is another Chinese novel, and that is Journey to the West by Wu Chengyan. So this book is also called The Monkey King. It follows the Monkey King as he tries to rise in power. He goes from like being human to being like a god, and then after he messes with the gods too much, they're like, you know what? You need to go into the corner. So they like strip him of his magic, and then they force him to take a monk along with like 2 or 3 other super powerful beings across from India all the way to China to bring Buddhism to China. So it's like the mythical origins of how Buddhism came to China. It is a hilarious read. All right, the next one is Carmilla by J. Sheridan Elfinu. So this is, I always say, the female equivalent to Dracula. It basically documents this woman who gets this other young woman to be her companion, and this young woman is a blood-sucking vampire, basically. And that's what the story is about. It's a gothic, great book. The next one is The Island of Dr Moreau by H.G. Wells. This, again, was an author that I really struggled with because he wrote War of the Worlds, which I absolutely love. He wrote so many books that I absolutely loved, so it's hard to narrow it down. But this was the first book I had read by him, and it is just incredible. It's about this young man who gets washed up on this island where this Dr. Moreau splices together animals and people. It's as horrific as it sounds, but it's like a gothic horror. Next one is one that I bet most people have never heard of, and that's How the Other Half Lives by Jacob A. Riis. So Riis, I'm not sure. He was a journalist in New York City in the late 1800s, and he wrote this book documenting basically the squalor that the poor lived in, how they didn't have proper living conditions, how they had to like have a 8-person family in this tiny little room, how they couldn't get jobs, how they didn't have proper latrines or bathrooms, and he painted such a vivid picture of New York City for the poor in the late 1800s, and it actually brought about a massive change in sanitary conditions as well as living conditions for these poor. Buildings started to have more regulations. It's a brilliant book and one that I never hear anybody talking about. All right, the next one is My Man Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse. Basically, this is about a British gentleman and his butler, Jeeves, who solves problems for him. It's a hilarious series. This is the first book, and I've read, I think, the first 3 books. All right, the next one is King Solomon's Mines by H. Rider Haggard. This is a book following this man seeks to find King Solomon's legendary mines in northern Africa, I believe. I can't remember what country they're in. Maybe they're not in a country. Maybe it's just like a fictional place. And it's an adventure. The next one is The Book of Five Reams by Miyamoto Musushi. This is the equivalent to the Book of Chunsu, but in Japan. All right, the next one is another one that I never hear anybody talk about, and that is The Skylark or Space by E. Doc Smith. This book documents these group of men who put together this spaceship and go out into space. That's as much as I can say for now. They dub it the Skylark. That's why it's called that. And it's such a brilliant book, and I've never heard it talked about in sci-fi circles. And I'm not like a big sci-fi nerd fan, so I do not know that many classics that are sci-fi, but I read this one and I was like, this makes me want to read more sci-fi books. All right, the next one is 10 Days in a Madhouse by Nellie Bly. Nellie Bly was a journalist, also in New York City, I'm pretty sure, who decided to go undercover for 10 days in a women's lunatic asylum. She wanted to bring awareness to the treatment of people, especially women, in these sanatoriums where they weren't properly cleaned, they weren't properly fed, they had to sit in their little tiny rooms for hours and days, and it actually exacerbated any mental issues they had, and they were also tortured. So that some of these women who just were unwanted by their families were put into here even though they didn't have any mental issues, even if they weren't insane, but they were driven insane by this place. And it's a brilliant book. She wrote this book after coming out of the hospital, and it impacted and changed the way that asylums were run, and it actually brought about eventually to the closure of most asylums. All right, the next one is We by Yavogli Zamyatin. My pronunciation is just getting worse and worse. Basically, this is the dystopian novel that was the precursor to A Brave New World in 1984. It inspired later writers, and it is very similar to those books. And it's about there are these rooms where people live in where there are glass walls, so you can't do anything without like your neighbors seeing everything, and of course you are monitored completely by the government. It was written during World War I, I believe, around that era. So it was quite early for a dystopian novel. It's a fascinating book to read, but very weird, very disturbing. All right, the next one is Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. I've not read enough Franz Kafka. I do want to read more, but when I read Metamorphosis, it completely blew me out of the water. It's about this guy who wakes up one day as a giant bug, and he has to live with his family, ostracizing him for becoming this monster. And it's a fascinating book. It's more of a novella, so it's shorter, but I have seen it as an individual copy, so it counts as a book. It's a brilliant book, and I want to read and understand more of Kafka because he's such a deep individual, and I'm not that way at all, so I need to learn more about him. The next one is Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck. Pearl S. Buck was a woman who lived in China most of her life. The Good Earth documents this poor farming family in China and how they work to have enough money and get enough money and grow their family. It's a fascinating book. All right, the next one is Call of the Wild by Jack London. Jack London wrote in the late 1800s, and he went up to the Klondike, Alaska, Canada, in that area, and he saw just how horribly, how difficult life was up there, as well as just how horribly these sled dogs were being treated. So he brought awareness to that by writing books like this. Now, personally, Call of the Wild is my favorite. He also wrote White Fang, which is almost very similar to Call of the Wild. He wrote a short story, To Start a Fire, which is also very good, but this is my favorite one. It tells of Buck, who is this dog who is kidnapped from his happy family home in San Francisco and forced to go up to Alaska and Canada to become a sled dog. And it is a brutal story. If you can't deal with dogs being hurt, maybe skip over this, but I loved it, and it brought awareness to just how horrible sled dogs were being treated back then. All right, the next one is Frankenstein by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. So this is not a horror. You cannot tell me it's a horror. It's a psychological examination of the evil of man. And it is about this man, Dr. Frankenstein, who creates a monster. And that monster is a wonderful person. And then because he is treated horribly by the world around him, he becomes the monster that they expect him to be. It is a fascinating book. Highly recommend it if you haven't read it, but I feel like everybody at least knows the plot. The next one is Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. This is a comedy about three men in a boat that decide to go down the Thames in England, and madness ensues, and it's a hilarious book. You will be laughing the entire way through. The next book is Passage to India by E.M. Forster. I want to read more of Forster's work because I've heard so many good things about him, but this is the only book that I've read. And I don't know anything about Forster himself. But this book tells of the British colonial government in India and shows both the perspective of the British there and the Indians there, and just that gap of understanding between the two. And it's a brilliant book. The next one is a weird one to have on this list, but I can put anything I want on this list. So that is The Lost Continent of Mu by James Churchward. Churchward was an insane individual that theorized that there was actually a continent in the middle of the Pacific Ocean between, China and the United States, and that was the origin of civilization. Yes, and the evidence he used, wait for it, the evidence he used was that every civilization around the world uses figures of the sun in their drawing, because the sun is something that clearly only could have come from this Mu world. Anyway, a couple of years back, I got fascinated with the idea because in the late 19th century, it became super popular to theorize that there was this continent, and sometimes it was called Atlantis, sometimes Mu. Lemuria was another one that another author called it. Basically, it was this concept that that civilization, there was this advanced civilization that sunk into the sea. Is it real? No, of course not. But I got fascinated with learning about this because the theories about this was ridiculous. He wrote this in about the 20s, but this has been an idea that had gone on for maybe 50 years before him. Obviously, with what we know about the tectonic plates of nowadays, it's not possible that a continent could have simply collapsed in the sea. It's one thing for a tiny island that could have been Atlantis to sink into the sea, but it's a fascinating read. Okay, I loved it. It's like a sci-fi reading it. All right, next one is Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier. I've read a few books by du Maurier. I know that Rebecca is probably her most famous one, but I had mixed feelings about that. I didn't like the ending that much, even if the gothic feeling was just perfect. And I did like My Cousin Rachel better, but I think my favorite one is Jamaica Inn. It's about this young woman who goes to stay with her, I'm pretty sure it's her cousin, who is married to this innkeeper who's very suspicious. Yeah, so she's trying to solve these attacks on the coast of ships and raiders, and it's an adventure gothic romance novel, and it is brilliant. It's my favorite du Maurier that I've read so far, but I do want to read more of hers. And finally, the last book. Can you believe it's the last one? I've talked so much. The last one is Far from the Maddening Crowd by Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy wrote quite a few books. Tess of the D'Urbervilles is probably his most famous one. I have not read it yet. I saw the movie and I really disliked the movie, so maybe I will force myself to read it someday. But Far from the Maddening Crowd follows this young woman who inherits a farm and is told, well, you can't run it by yourself. You're a young woman, you're not married, you need to marry. And so she decides to poo-poo all the haters and run that farm herself. And she gets help, she hires out people, she ends up having several men trying to vie for her attention, and she ends up marrying one of them at the end. I won't say who, but it's a great novel. I know that there's a lot that could be put on this list that wasn't, so I'm sorry if your favorite was not on this list, but I'd love to know if there'd be some that you would add onto this list. Have you read any of these books, especially the ones that are more lesser known? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I post every Saturday and Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!